Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Robots Are Coming. And today I'll be interviewing Professor Mark Moyar, professor at Hillsdale College as the William P. Harris Chair of Military History. From 2018 to 2019, he served as the director of the Office of Civilian Military Cooperation of USAID, and he previously served as the director of the Project on Military and Diplomatic History at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in DC. He holds a BA summa cum laude from Harvard and a Ph.D. from Cambridge. His most recent book, Triumph Regained, The Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968, is his most latest work, and we'll be discussing it in this podcast episode. And before we get started, I just wanted to say that we have a Patreon now. It's patreon.com/robotscoming now, where you can support the podcast, where I can invest it back with better equipment, content, and help with my passion for both technology and public policy. And secondly, I have a Substack newsletter under my name at kenhinih.substack.com. And I'll be posting more of my opinions on things ranging from technology, public policy, all the way into neighborhood history. And my name is Ken Hin, your host with The Robots Are Coming. Let's get started. So before we get started, Professor Moyer, do you mind introducing yourself a little bit more, saying about where you got to, teaching military history at Hillsdale College and how you got interested in this topic in particular?
hmm Yeah, so my interest in Vietnam initially began in high school when I had a high school teacher who was a Vietnam veteran, who was a very great teacher and great person, and he didn't seem to mesh with the sort of stereotypical veterans you see depicted in popular culture. And then in college, I was attended undergraduate at Harvard University and took a course on the Vietnam War there. And it seemed to be propagating a lot of the sort of conventional wisdom about the war. But as I started doing some research on my own for that class and in my undergraduate thesis, I came to the view that the historical conventional wisdom was deeply flawed. And I wrote a book initially on the Phoenix Program pacification, furthered that conclusion. And then in the late 90s, I decided to do a general history of the war. And as I got into that too, just finding out more and more that changed or contradicted what people were saying about it. And so I, in fact, found so much that it ended up turning into multiple volumes. So the first volume was published in 2006, A Triumph Forsaken. I then got pulled into a number of other directions by Iraq, Afghanistan, a number of other things. And so it took me even longer to write the second one, but Triumph Regained, the second one is now out, and that goes from the middle of 65 to 68. So 65, the first one, Triumph Forsaken, goes up to the decision by President Johnson to intervene in the ground war and looks at all of the problems that arose, and most notably the coup against Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963. And then this one picks up with the American troops entering the ground war and goes through the end of the pivotal year of 1968.
And Dr. Moyer, could you tell us about the conventional wisdom that was found within North Vietnamese sources, and how they depicted their win over South Vietnam and the Americans, and how you found these particular resources and where were those particular resources?
So the North Vietnamese publicly, for during and after the war, put out a lot of information that seemed to support the mainstream view of the war, at least among American journalists and academics, that South Vietnam was a corrupt, hopeless regime, that North Vietnamese forces were virtuous and they were always going to win, and they had few difficulties ultimately achieving that purpose. Now, in the course of my research over a number of years, I met a former U.S. government linguist named Merle Pribino, who supplied me with translations of huge numbers of North Vietnamese sources. And a lot of these were not intended for public audiences. And so they're a lot more candid, and they really change a lot of how we think about the Vietnam War. And starting in the Diem period, publicly at the time, the North Vietnamese denounced him as this terrible reactionary, but we now see from their side, they took him a lot more seriously as a serious nationalist figure, and that the war during the Diem years was actually going pretty well for the South Vietnamese government, which is a hugely controversial topic. And then they tell us about why North Vietnam actually launches this big offensive at the end of 1964, which changes how we look at the causes and consequences of the war and how they were paying attention to President Johnson's, not just his statements, but also what he was doing, for instance, after the Tonkin Gulf incidents. And so we now have a different perspective on what they did and how it was influenced by American decisions. And then when you get into the period I'm looking at, the North Vietnamese sources cast a lot of light on the military aspects, and they actually indicate things were going worse for the North Vietnamese than we've been led to believe. And also that North Vietnamese, because of all the problems they're encountering, actually become very impatient with what's going on by 1967, because there's a myth that the North Vietnamese were somehow infinitely patient and were not subject to your normal human emotions and thoughts. But it turns out, in fact, that they were themselves getting very impatient, which is why they go on to launch this huge offensive in 1968.
And for my own research, which I peered over some books on North Vietnamese perspectives, and also which were written by the Viet Cong. I found out that some of them wrote about how they were able to galvanize their people through having the farmers and the workers revolts, and that's how they gather the sources for the troops that they had in the North Vietnamese. How true is that? And could you elaborate to our audience a little bit more about the North strategy from your own research? Because this is from the first person resource that I read, and also from my father, who was living under the communist regime, and also my grandfather, who was like a South Vietnamese military guy. So those are from outside perspectives. But from your research, like
Mm-hmm.
what exactly happened? What was the North strategy?
Yeah, well, those are excellent and very tricky questions because one of the things and one of the reasons I did such a lengthy history is the war changes greatly over time. It also varies a lot from one region of South Vietnam to another. As far as broadly, I'll talk about the earlier period in it's really 1960 when the communists decide they're going to launch this Maoist rural insurrection, which does largely follow the model that Mao Zedong had used in the Chinese Civil War. So what they do is, well, first of all, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that this isn't just something that sprang up out of nowhere, which is sometimes how it gets depicted in Western accounts and even in North Vietnamese propaganda. But what really happens is that if you go back to 1954, North Vietnam and South Vietnam are split, and about 1 million Northerners head to the South because they want to get away from repressive communist rule. But there's a smaller number that go from the South to the North. So these are communists who are born in southern Vietnam. And when they go north, they are then trained for years to launch a rural insurrection. And so Hanoi's hoping that by the end of the 50s, they can win in the South without a big war, but then they realize that the South Vietnamese government's too good for that. So in 1960, they start this insurgency using these people who have been trained in the North and sent back into the South. And one of the key things to remember in insurgency is that you need experienced, well-trained leadership. And so that's what they have. They have this group of people who are infiltrated from north to the south. And we'll see that really throughout this insurgency, that it is dependent on this core of Communist Party leaders. Now, they are able to recruit a lot of local peasants, which they do, you know, through two primary mechanisms. One is simply the force of personality and persuasiveness of the leadership. And so you see certain individuals in the Communist Party hierarchy particularly good, and the Vietnamese peasants respect them for their leadership abilities. And then the other thing they offer is their armed strength. So the peasants, historically, as in many other societies, they tend to want to side with the stronger power. And so when the Viet Cong, as they're known, come in and start killing village officials, that makes an impression on people, and you want to be on the right side. So in the early 60s, you do see major successes by the communists in building up these rural movements. So some parts of Vietnam, they're never successful, but they are in certain areas. And this will go through a number of cycles. So in 1962, South Vietnamese government starts the Strategic Hamlet Program, which I think is actually quite effective. And we know that now from seeing the North Vietnamese sources. But then in 63, you have a coup that overthrows the government, and that program is dismantled. And for the next couple of years, things change back, and the Viet Cong are again very strong. And sort of their peak of their insurgency is in 1965, just before the Americans come in, because people think the South Vietnamese government's going to fall, so why not get on the winning side? But then when the Americans come in, the ship tilts back, and the communists are never really able to gain as much of a foothold thereafter. And ultimately, by the early 70s, this is mainly a question of North Vietnamese conventional army coming down, and it has very little support from the people within South Vietnam.
Before I get into what President Johnson should have done, which you mentioned a lot in your book about what he could have done if he heeded the advice of his generals, I want to talk about particularly the Kennedy administration and what you think they should have done early on, or even before their administration, to counter the uh, the Viet Cong very early on before they started taking over. Like, if we were to maybe have a time machine and go back and give advice to Kennedy on how to handle that war, what should we have done?
Well, Kennedy makes a huge mistake in 1961. Just after he comes into office, he's told, or just as he's coming into office, he's told by President Eisenhower that the communists are moving into Laos, and this is a potential avenue for mass infiltration from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, and that you, if necessary, should use U.S. troops to stop this. And uh, we know too that the North Vietnamese had tried to come straight across the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam, but they'd actually been disrupted. So the pivotal area now is Laos, and so Kennedy is thinking about it, and he runs into some other troubles, most notably the Bay of Pigs debacle, and that makes him very skittish about other military operations. And so he decides instead to accept the recommendation of Averell Harriman, a senior diplomat, to negotiate a neutralization agreement of Laos. And supposedly the Soviets will convince the North Vietnamese to stay out of Laos. So the agreement, which is reached in 1962, says that all foreign military personnel have to leave Laos. So Americans had some military advisors, they leave, but the North Vietnamese end up staying in Laos and they never leave. And there are no real serious repercussions for that. And so this will ensure the flow of men and material from north to south for the remainder of the war with relatively little disruption. And if you are in a position where you can indefinitely send men and material into the opposing side's country and they don't come back to you, you're in a very good position strategically. So that was error number one. And Kennedy does do some good things in terms of supporting the Diem regime with additional manpower and equipment supporting the strategic Hamlet program. But his other critical mistake is the coup in November 1963, which is a very convoluted and sad story. And I think one of the worst mistakes the United States has ever made in its foreign policies. And I'm trying to forsake, and I go into great depth on this series of events. And Kennedy himself is kind of waffling as to whether to actually support a coup, but he sends over Henry Cabot Lodge as his ambassador, and Lodge is one of his political rivals, which makes Kennedy very reluctant to try to rein him in. And so Lodge will end up pushing for this coup, even though Kennedy at the end is trying to put the brakes on it. But this coup is thought to be, by people like Lodge, thought to be sort of a way to speed things up in the war effort because they think Diem is not very good and they can get better people. But it turns out to have a very opposite effect. And so what happens is you have a lot of purges of the South Vietnamese government, and you have new leaders rotating in, none of whom are very effective. And it's sort of that downward spiral that will ultimately require the U.S. to intervene militarily.
And also, I want to talk about from the naval war history side of things that Kennedy did send in a ton of advisors from the U.S. Navy, and there was a lot of problems with communication, with culture, and I think that sending advisors back then would have been an interesting take, but not if these U.S. naval members didn't understand how to interact properly with those Vietnamese or those South Vietnamese officers. So maybe potentially, what if Kennedy or an administration sent in more advisors who were culturally competent or understood how to communicate in Vietnamese? Like, could that change the tide of the war? Um, Maybe like looking forward towards like Taiwan, like should we train our U.S. naval advisors to understand, I don't know, Taiwan Chinese or learning their culture before we prepare for such a conflict? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this general concept has come up again in context of more recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I taught for a while at the Marine Corps University where we were looking at this issue of how do you get people who have greater familiarity with the culture and the language. Uh, it's more difficult than it sounds. It's for one thing, language aptitude varies a lot. There's a lot of people who are not especially good. So you have to select people who have that special gift if you want to give them language training. The cultural part, that's a lengthy process. And I think it makes sense if you adopt a policy where you rotate or keep certain people in the same areas for much of their career so that they build that knowledge. And it could have been done to a greater degree in Vietnam, certainly, but it would have taken time to do that. Now, you do have so many people going to Vietnam. Ultimately, towards the latter part of the war, you have people who are back for repeat tours. But historically, the military bureaucracy tends to want to just rotate people randomly, and so it becomes very hard to ensure that certain people get sent back to the same place. And you could also argue that we don't know where the next war is going to be, so we don't want to have too many people focused in one particular area. But it certainly is an issue for the Americans. And one thing is worth pointing out about the advisory experience is that in many cases, the South Vietnamese didn't need advisors kind of helping them with tactics and operations. Now, sometimes that's the case, but South Vietnam also, especially as time goes on, has South Vietnamese who know how to do that, and so other aspects of the advisory experience are more important. Things like calling in airstrikes, obtaining logistical support, coordinating with American units. Those are things that require less of a culturally focused skill set. And then South Vietnamese Navy, like a number of like the rest of the South Vietnamese military, is also gets ripped apart by the coup of 1963 and the Navy leadership was supportive of President Ziem, and I believe that the chief of naval operations or the equivalent is assassinated on the day of the Ziem coup, and that's part of what the plotters did was that they got a bunch of the leaders of critical units together and then either arrested or killed them on the day of the coup. But then, after the coup, anyone who was seen as supportive of President Ziem gets arrested. Some of them even get put in jail. And so you're getting rid of a lot of your best people. And eventually, years to come, they'll start to bring some of these people back. But yeah, it's a massive setback for all of the armed forces.
And Dr. Moyer, you mentioned that the war could have ended victoriously had President Johnson heeded the advice of his generals. What were the advice of his generals?
The Certainly some earlier advice before this period in the 64 timeframe when there's people telling him to ramp up the bombing, to not talk about leaving Asia to Asia sake. But in the 65 period, once America is committed to the ground war, there are a few things the military is really pushing. One is to go into the Ho Chi Minh Trail area with ground forces. And this would have cut off the logistical supply. And at the time, there's a lot of dispute. Well, how do we know this is going to really work? Aren't the Viet Cong really dependent heavily on local resources? Well, North Vietnamese sources make clear that, in fact, it would have been strategically devastating to them had the Americans gone in to block the trail. The Americans are bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail at various times, but without forces on the ground, you cannot actually stop that flow of men and supplies. And only by 65, you are heavily dependent on manpower from the north and weapons and ammunition. And there still is a Viet Cong, but the North Vietnamese army is by this time starting to take the war over. And by the way, I should point out too, it's a bit of a misnomer to separate the Viet Cong from the North Vietnamese army because they are actually all part of the North Vietnamese government. There used to be this idea that the Viet Cong were independent of Hanoi, but we know from North Vietnamese own side that that's clearly not the case. They had an interest in propagating that myth. But, by 65, in so-called Viet Cong units, you're already starting to see North Vietnamese soldiers taking their places because once the Americans come in, a lot fewer South Vietnamese are going into communist units, so to have more and more troops coming from North Vietnam. The other big thing that the military keeps pushing without success with Johnson is to intensify the bombing of the North. And they are critical of Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's strategy for the air war, which is called gradual escalation. Gradual escalation was based on academic theories of conflict where you could use starting off at a low level of intensity and slowly increasing the amount of bombing, that this would help you in your negotiations and convincing the other side to desist. But we know now that clearly that was actually the opposite of what occurred because the North Vietnamese see this low level of bombing. They take that as a sign of weakness. They aren't bought into this academic theorizing about conflict limitation. And the low intensity also gives the North Vietnamese time to build up their air defenses before America really gets serious. It's not till 1967 that you see the escalation really starting to take hold. And Johnson does this partly because the military and Congress are really starting to complain about the lack of harm that the bombing's doing. And so just as Secretary of Defense McNamara and the generals have to go speak before Congress, Johnson approves intensified strikes near Hanoi. And those strikes actually do great damage. And Hanoi is brought near the point of starvation. but largely because the Americans don't fully realize what's going on, Johnson will subsequently take the pressure off, and the supply situation in the North uh, abates, and they are able to continue prosecuting the war.
And in light of General Westmoreland's military strategies, how did Westmoreland come to choose the military strategies? Why did he choose those particular military strategies, and how were they ultimately settled on a singular strategy during the war?
And Westmoreland's been criticized heavily for his strategy and tactics. And I think you have to look at the constraints under which he's operating. I said, I think better U.S. strategy would have involved going into Laos, possibly also Cambodia, possibly also at least parts of North Vietnam. And Westmoreland lobbies for those things, but he's told no by the president. And so, given that he's confined to South Vietnam, I do think he makes the best use of the resources he has. So he decides to engage in what he calls a war of attrition, basically inflicting damage on the North Vietnamese forces to the greatest extent you can. And for tactics, he uses search and destroy. So basically sending U.S. units all over South Vietnam to look for North Vietnamese forces and to destroy them. So why is this controversial? Um, the For one thing, sometimes it's assumed it didn't really have a function, but it did have or any real logic behind it. But the logic is that the attrition will buy time for the South Vietnamese to get back on their feet because they've had this coup and subsequently all sorts of military defeats. That attrition will buy time for them to rehabilitate themselves and hopefully get to a more self-sufficient posture in the future. Now, the part about search and destroy is most controversial is that it goes all over the country, and critics argue that, well, they should have just kept the military forces near the population because this was a war about the people. And so if you're sending out troops into the jungles and mountains where nobody is, that you are wasting time and you're helping the enemy get greater access to the population. I think that's wrong for a number of reasons. So, first of all, part of the rationale that Westmoreland had in doing this was that he would send the Americans out to these remote areas because the Americans could not interact very effectively with the South Vietnamese. They don't speak the language, they don't know the culture. There's not time to get them ready for that. So if you go out into remote areas, you can use America's superior firepower mobility to maximum effect, and you let the South Vietnamese forces, which are quite large, let them deal with protecting the population. And I think that division of labor does make sense. Now, the other reason to go after them in these remote regions is that it keeps them off balance and deprives them of the initiative. Because what happens, and this does happen from time to time, when they're left alone, they then show up and can attack the government forces that are trying to defend the population. Because they have the initiative, they can attack them in overwhelming numbers. Also, if you leave them alone, they can build up logistical lines from Laos and Cambodia towards the population centers. And once they do that, then they can undertake sustained attacks on the population centers, which are very, very difficult to deal with. I mean, most significant example in this period is the city of Hue in 1968. The North Vietnamese are able to build their supply lines up to near the city and then use that to support an assault by 20,000 troops into the city, which results in the massacre of at least 3,000 civilians, and then also to massive damage to the city in the attempt to retake it.
And how did the American military operations enable the South Vietnamese government to recover from the massive instability that you mentioned after the assassination of President Diem near 1963?
So once the Americans arrive, and there's first some uncertainty as to exactly how well they're going to do because the North Vietnamese have been very impressive in how they've been fighting against the South Vietnamese. So people aren't quite sure how exactly this will play out. But in a series of battles starting in August of 1965 with Operation Starlight, the Americans are able to defeat large North Vietnamese forces in battle, thanks heavily to their superior firepower, their air power, ability to move by air, call in airstrikes. And the North Vietnamese do not have aircraft or helicopters or the heavy weaponry the Americans have. So once it's clear that the Americans have halted the North Vietnamese, you see a decline in sort of political intrigue within South Vietnam. And the Americans also, as their presence increases, they make clear that they don't want any more coups to take place given what's happened. And you will ultimately have 1967, the first democratic national elections in South Vietnam. And I should say the first legitimate ones, because in the past, the winner would usually get 99% of the vote. And in this one, it's, I think, around 35%. Um, so you have that progress in terms of democracy. North Vietnam never has a democracy in this period, and they don't have any trouble um, fighting the war. So it does depend a lot too on who's there. But you have um, President Nguyen Van Chu rises to the top during this time and proves to be a a better leader than any of the people that had come since President Diem, and he's able to ameliorate a variety of factions in South Vietnam. So we don't see the same sort of instability after 65. There is a episode in 1966 where some Buddhist monks in the northern provinces of South Vietnam try to stir up political trouble, and government seems to be wobbly at that point. But Ambassador Lodge, who had supported the coup a few years earlier, now comes out against it, and that helps ensure that the government will prevail. And so after that, you really have a pretty stable situation, which does allow the South Vietnamese to get back on their feet. And by 1968, they are militarily substantially better than they had been in 1965.
And what role did the U.S. play in sustaining public support for the war through the end of 1968? Did the Americans really give South Vietnam realistic hopes for long-term survival?
So the American people are pretty supportive of the war as American troops go in 1965. Now, Lyndon Johnson will be criticized heavily by a lot of Americans for refusing to rally the country for war. He doesn't make sales pitches to the people as to why this war is important. An obvious contrast is Franklin Roosevelt in World War II with his fireside chats, where he would spend a lot of time explaining to Americans, here's what we're fighting for, here's why it's important, here's why we are demanding sacrifices of the American people. And Johnson later in his term will actually acknowledge that this was a mistake on his part, that he, or at least he suggested, no, it might have been a mistake. He, uh, for domestic reasons, deliberately tries to downplay the war. He thinks it's going to overshadow and overtake his domestic programs. But towards the end of his time in office, he makes comments indicating, well, maybe we should have tried to rally patriotic spirit. Now, one of the most interesting things is that despite this lack of presidential leadership, you actually see support for the war remaining pretty strong to the end of Johnson's presidency. And that's one of the most interesting things I found in working on Triumph Regained, is that People have long believed that support for the war plummets in 1968 after the Tet Offensive, and there is some sort of misleading polling data that seem to support that. But when you look at the actual numbers, the American people, less than 20% of them, even in 1968, actually want the United States to get out. The rest have some variations on we either escalate or we keep things the same or we gradually turn things over to the South Vietnamese. So the American people, just even though the president really does not do much to sell them on the war, they for themselves see that the war is worthwhile because they are aware of one thing, the threat of international communism, and for another, they also understand in general, as a nation, it's not a good idea to make a massive commitment to some place and then decide to pull out in the middle of it and leave your ally hanging in the lurch. And one thing too that gets forgotten in all of this, at least nowadays, is that this was a war to prevent the spread of communism fundamentally, which is not just a threat to U.S. interests, but it's a threat to humanity. Over the course of the 20th century, it's estimated 100 million people are killed by communism, more than by anything else, including fascism. And so this was an important part of the U.S. effort to stop this ideology. And I think, ultimately the U.S. is successful. I mean, communism is basically bankrupt today, except at some American universities, and Vietnam, ends up not being able to stop it in Vietnam. But as I argue in the book, the events in Vietnam encourage people in other places, especially Indonesia, to resist communism, and we therefore now have a world today where most of the countries on Asia's periphery are hostile or at best neutral towards China, which is hugely important since China is now our main adversary.
A new question I had for you, Professor, is about the anti-war efforts that were spurred by the media, student movements, and all throughout the country. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Professor?
And so the anti-war movement is a particularly interesting topic, and another one where I think there's a lot of misinformation. There is often an assumption that this just arose because people saw this terrible war going on and were appalled by it. But it turns out the anti-war movement on campus doesn't really get going until about 2 years into the war, until middle of 1967. So why is that? Did the war suddenly change in 1967? Were there escalation and violence or discoveries of war crimes? No, in fact, no, it's not that. What changes in 1967 is are the rules surrounding the draft, and the government changes and reduces exemptions for students going to graduate school, which means for a lot of undergraduates who had thought they could evade the draft by going to graduate school, now suddenly they are faced with getting drafted and going to Vietnam. And this is the rising baby boom generation, which I would argue is sort of the spoiled brat generation, where they had the most affluence of any generation in history thus far, and yet they are the least grateful. So you suddenly see this surge on campuses, and in the book I cite a number of former anti-war veterans who acknowledge that what's going on is much more about self-preservation than any sort of high-minded principles or concern about what's actually going on in Vietnam. So what happens is, I think this generation, this rising baby boom generation, and by the way, this is certainly not all of them, and a lot of the boomers do go serve honorably in Vietnam, but some of them decide they don't want to go, they don't want to get drafted. And so historically, that was what the young men in the country were expected to do at time of war. You would go serve in the military. So how do you deal with that if you're these people who don't want to go? They decide instead, well, we want to show this war is flawed because if you're dodging the draft for a good war, if this was World War II, you look pretty bad. So we need to show that this is actually a bad war. And so we're going to change how we and others think about this and start maligning our allies, start paying homage to our enemies and depicting Ho Chi Minh as a virtuous nationalist, which is completely false. I think also, what is done to malign the South Vietnamese is particularly unfortunate. If you look at, I think of one of the most important comparisons to look at is the three big cases in the Cold War in Asia. We have three cases where the United States backs powerful anti-communists against powerful communists. The first one is China, the late 40s. U.S. ends up bailing out on the Chinese, but the Chinese nationalists flee to Taiwan, so you have a separate Taiwan. Then you have the Koreas. We support South Korea, and in that case, stalemate results in a communist North Korea and an anti-communist South Korea. And then we get to Vietnam, and I bring this up particularly because if you think of all the things that get said about the South Vietnamese, that, oh, they're corrupt and autocratic, the same things were said about Taiwan and South Korea. Now look today where Taiwan and South Korea are. They're two of the most prosperous countries in the world, the envy of Asia. Look at China and North Korea. I mean, who in their right mind would want to go of their own volition and go live in those places? So I think the same things that work in South Vietnam. It was certainly at the time people were not as democratic as we would have liked. There was some corruption, but South Vietnam would have been, I think, far better off had the Americans stayed there. But this fact is, tends to get swept under the rug, and people here will now say, oh well, Vietnam is, now they want to be friendly with the United States, and they're really not that bad, but they're still a communist police state. They're much less prosperous than their non-communist neighbors. And so I think, again, when you think in terms of both strategy and the country you want to support, and also from a moral perspective, that that the anti-war movement fundamentally gets it wrong.
And before I want to know how you personally stay engaged with military history. As a budding author writing about the naval war in Vietnam myself, I'm constantly scoping great books like yourself on the Vietnam War, and also books from my local library, and also talking to professors from the U.S. Naval Academy and professors such as yourself. Um, what was your step-by-step process about engaging with military history, and what was your step-by-step process of getting published by the Naval Institute Press?
Well, military history is one of the casualties of the Vietnam War, and that's part of the legacy of the anti-war movement. Is after these people become campus activists, they go on to dominate academia and the media, and part of the demonization of the Vietnam War uh, is the demonization of military history, which on the face of it seems a little puzzling too, because military history per se is not necessarily for or against war. It's describing war and describing what has happened. But these people have, they had their own view of what people should be studying. They've also marginalized other types of history like diplomatic history and economic history, and in the promotion of more radical versions of history, race, class, and gender, especially. And so there used to be a lot of military historians on American campuses. There are now very few, and there's only a few PhD programs left. I actually went to England to get my PhD because the English still have a greater respect for military history, and they're not subject to the same sort of ideological influences. So a lot of the military history has to be written now outside of the academy. And I went and worked at the Marine Corps University for a while, which was a great experience. And military institutions are among the few places now where historians, professional historians, can actually get full time jobs. So I'm leery of recommending that people actually get PhDs in military history or even in history in general, because there are unfortunately a lot of political pitfalls. But for people who are really passionate about it, there are still opportunities. And even when I was going through the process and thinking through what I wanted to do with my career, it was already clear. These negative trends were already pretty evident. So I already kind of had in mind that I would probably end up at one of the military institutions after getting my PhD, as I went to the Marine Corps University, and probably would still be there, except there was a corruption scandal, which I won't get into, but led to a loss of funding for the position I had. And so I did some other things outside of the academy before now coming back into it at Hillsdale. But uh, it's tough. The other thing I recommend to people too who are interested in military history, if they want to try to make a profession out of it, is to start off in some field other than military history, perhaps a regional focus, and get tenure in that at a university. And then once you have tenure, you're kind of free to do more of what you want to do, and you can look more on the military side of things, at later points in your career.
And what was your step-by-step process of getting published by the Naval Institute Press?
Getting published as a first-time author is difficult because it's a bit of a catch-22, and that publishers prefer to have people who've already published. So getting that first book is challenging. The same thing goes with agents. Some publishers don't even want to look at books when people don't have agents. So in my case, I did not have an agent for my first book. I sent it around to a number of publishers, and few were interested. Naval Institute Press at the time was particularly interested, and I had been a subscriber to Proceedings, their monthly publication, and they turned out to be excellent. And there are a number of university presses that are also a little more open to first-time authors, and Society for Military History, their annual convention usually has some of the military or the university presses there. University presses are not quite as ideological as academic history departments, partly because they have to depend a bit more on appealing to the general public. The general public is a lot more interested in military history than academia is.
And a final question for you, Professor. What is planned for 2023 and beyond? I know you have a book coming out. It's called Triumph Regained, the Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968. I saw that you had it out on Amazon.com. What else is going to be next for your book writing or classes or anything that you have in mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got a project I'm working on recent history and some corruption that I encountered when I was working in the Trump administration. So, going to finish that up, and then I'm going to get back to the final volume of the Vietnam trilogy, which picks up in 1969 with the arrival of Richard Nixon, and then goes through all the way to the end of 75 and the final fall of Saigon. The other ones I spent a lot of time on. One of the things you learn in history is that it's possible to put out books quickly, but the quality is going to suffer. And so I think you're better off investing more time in fewer books. And I've written some books more quickly, but for these books, because there's so much information and so controversial, it took 7 years to do Triumph Forsaken. This one, I was working on other things intermittently, but it's been, 16 years between the last Vietnam book and this one. I don't think it's going to take 16 years because I have uh, greater time to focus on it now, but it'll be several years to get through all of the documents uh, and just do all the writing for this last and equally controversial period.
And before we sign off, I may I ask uh, what are your top five books that you recommend? Because I know you have a ton of publications right now, outside of the current book that you have, called Triumph Regained the Vietnam War, 1965 to 1968. What are some of your other books that you would recommend to our viewers who are starting to maybe get interested in military history or starting
Mm-hmm.
to get interested in the Vietnam War?
Yeah, well, certainly Triumph Forsaken, which is the book that precedes this, published in 2006. And that book generated a lot of controversy that actually led to a book of essays called Triumph Revisited, in which people commented on the book, and then I got a chance to respond to them. The My first book with the Naval Institute Press on the Phoenix and pacification be of interest. So it's more specialized, and I will say, as a writer, you're constantly improving. So I think, looking back, I've progressed as a writer, and that one's not as easy to read as some. But there's also a book I did on counterinsurgency called The Question of Command, which has a chapter on Vietnam. It looks more broadly at themes of counterinsurgency, and it you know, I think helps understand how history can be used for good and ill in counterinsurgency. And then there's my book on special operations forces, Oppose Any Foe, which came out in 2017. It also has some coverage of Vietnam, but that one is perhaps makes for the easiest reading because there's special operations forces. There's lots of interesting stories to be told as well as insights to be had.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation, Professor. And um, thank you everyone for listening to this episode of The Robots Are Coming. Next time we'll have even more great professors speaking on the topics of law, entrepreneurship, military history, and public policy. So make sure you subscribe to The Robots Are Coming wherever you're listening to. Tell all your friends to listen to that as well. Thanks.